In the windswept territory of Wyoming, 1889, a pregnant woman stumbles through the darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back and bruises hidden beneath her worn shawl. Mara Ellis has finally escaped her husband's iron fist, but carrying his child, and with winter approaching, she faces a harsh truth. Freedom might cost her everything. When she collapses at the gates of the most prosperous ranch in 3 counties, wealthy cowboy Cassian Holt makes a decision that will change both their lives forever. This isn't just another woman seeking shelter. This is a mother who will discover what it means to be truly protected, and a lonely man who will learn that some families aren't born, they're chosen. But when her violent husband comes to reclaim what he believes is his, will Cassian's fortune and fierce loyalty be enough to protect the family he never knew he wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Holt Ranch in shades of gold and amber, stretching across 20,000 acres of Wyoming's finest grazing land. Cassian Holt stood on his wraparound porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching his cattle move like dark clouds across the distant pastures. At 35, he had built something his father could never have imagined, a cattle empire that stretched from the foothills to the river valley, supplemented by silver mines that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The ranch house itself spoke of quiet prosperity rather than ostentation. Built from local timber and stone, it rose 2 stories with broad windows that captured the morning light and evening sunsets. The furniture inside had been crafted by skilled artisans in Denver, but every piece served a purpose. This was a working man's home, enlarged and refined by success, but never forgetting its roots. Elena Morales had been with the Holt family for 15 years, arriving as a young widow when Cassian's father still ran the ranch. Now approaching 50, her graying hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and her capable hands could manage everything from a difficult birth to a 7-course dinner for visiting cattle buyers. She had watched Cassian grow from a grieving son into the man who now employed 37 people and whose word carried weight from Cheyenne to Denver. "She's been awake for an hour," Elena reported, stepping onto the porch with her own cup of coffee. "Drinking the broth I made, asking no questions. That tells me plenty about where she's come from." Cassian nodded, his grey eyes fixed on the horizon. In his 35 years, he had learned to read people quickly, a necessity when dealing with cattle thieves, claim jumpers, and politicians who smiled while reaching for your wallet. The woman who had collapsed at his gates carried herself like someone accustomed to measuring every word, every gesture. Her clothes, though travel-worn and dusty, had been well made. The wedding ring she wore was gold, but scratched and dented as if it had been twisted nervously countless times. "What's your sense of her?" he asked Elena, whose judgment he trusted above all others. "She's educated, well-bred, but there's fear in her that goes bone deep." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. The kind of fear that comes from living with someone who uses their hands for more than gesturing. The ranch had always been Cassian's sanctuary, but it had also been his prison of sorts. 3 years earlier, he had been engaged to Rebecca Whitmore, daughter of a Denver banker who saw marriage as a merger opportunity. When she learned that Cassian intended to remain on the ranch rather than move to the city, she had made her choice. Clear, his money was welcome, but his way of life was not. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving him determined to never again open his heart to someone who might see his love as a commodity to be traded. "Her husband will come looking," Cassian said, stating what they both knew. "Yes, and when he does, we'll be ready." Elena's voice carried the steel that had helped her survive the deaths of her own husband and child years earlier. "But first, we help her heal." Inside the guest room on the 2nd floor, Mara Ellis sat by the window, watching the ranch come alive with the morning's work. Men moved with purpose between the barns and corrals, their voices carrying on the wind as they called to each other and the animals. It was so different from Clayton's estate, where the workers moved in fearful silence, always watching for their master's moods. Her hand moved instinctively to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. 7 months along, and every day brought the child closer to a world she couldn't predict. Clayton had made it clear that he viewed the pregnancy as an inconvenience, another mouth to feed, another claim on his attention. But watching the easy camaraderie between Cassian and his men through the window, Mara wondered what it might be like for a child to grow up in a place where strength meant protection rather than intimidation. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Ellis, may I come in?" Cassian stood in the doorway, hat in hand, with the careful posture of a man accustomed to being welcomed but taking nothing for granted. In the morning light, Mara could see him more clearly than she had the night before. Tall and lean, with the kind of strength that came from years of physical work, he carried himself with quiet confidence. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his grey eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his obvious capability. "Please, sit down," Mara said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything except whatever truth you're comfortable sharing." Cassian settled into the chair, his hat balanced on his knee. "Elena tells me you're feeling stronger this morning. Your housekeeper has been very kind. The room, the food, the care. I don't know how to repay such generosity. There's no debt to repay. This ranch has always been a place where people can find safety when they need it." Cassian's voice carried the weight of conviction. "My father taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to share." Mara studied his face, looking for the calculation she had learned to expect from men in positions of power. Instead, she found only steady patience. "My husband will be looking for me. I expect he will. What would you like me to know about that?" The simple question, asked without judgment or demands, nearly broke her composure. When had anyone last asked what she wanted, what she needed? Clayton Blackwood is not a man who accepts losing what he considers his property. He has influence, money, and no scruples about using both to get what he wants. Cassian nodded slowly. "The Blackwood who owns half the businesses in Buffalo Creek?" "The same. And he'll use every one of them to pressure you into giving me back." Mara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I should leave before I bring that trouble to your door." "Where would you go?" The question hung in the air because they both knew the answer. A pregnant woman alone in the Wyoming territory, with winter approaching and no family to turn to, had few options beyond charity or desperation. "I have some jewelry I could sell. Enough to get me to Denver, perhaps find work." "Mrs. Ellis." Cassian's voice was gentle but firm. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Your husband's influence doesn't extend to this ranch, and his money can't buy what matters most out here, the respect of good people who know right from wrong." Through the window, Mara watched a group of ranch hands working with a spirited horse in the corral. Their movements were patient, encouraging rather than forcing, building trust instead of breaking spirit. It was a foreign concept to her. Power, used to nurture rather than control. Why would you risk confronting Clayton for a stranger? Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the framed photograph on the dresser, a family portrait showing a younger version of himself, with an older man and woman, and another young man who shared his features. "My brother Thomas died 5 years ago. Pneumonia took him in 3 days, and there wasn't a doctor within 100 miles who could help." His voice carried old grief, softened by time but not forgotten. "Before he died, he made me promise that this ranch would always be a place where people could find help when they needed it most. I gave him my word." Mara felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the constant vigilance that had become second nature. "What happened to your parents?" "Father died 2 years after Thomas. Mother followed him within 6 months. She always said she was just keeping his chair warm until he was ready for her to join him. A small smile touched Cassian's lips. They were married 43 years, never spent more than a week apart. The contrast with her own marriage was stark and painful. Clayton had proposed to her not out of love, but because her father's bank held mortgages on several of his properties. Their wedding had been a business transaction, dressed up in white silk and orange blossoms. "I was married at 19, Mara said quietly. "I thought I was choosing security. Instead, I chose a beautiful prison. And now I'm choosing freedom. Even if I don't know what that looks like yet." Cassian stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Freedom looks different for everyone. But I can tell you this. It always starts with being in a place where you can make choices without fear." As he reached the door, Mara called after him, "Mr. Holt, thank you, not just for the shelter, but for asking what I wanted instead of telling me what you thought I needed. Everyone deserves to be heard, Mrs. Ellis, especially those who haven't been listened to in far too long." After he left, Mara remained by the window, watching the rhythm of ranch life. A young cowboy was teaching an even younger boy how to rope fence posts, their laughter carrying on the wind. The sight stirred something in her, a vision of her own child learning skills, with patience rather than criticism, growing up with role models who valued kindness as much as strength. For the first time since discovering she was pregnant, Mara allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. The baby kicked as if responding to her mother's newfound hope, and Mara smiled, a real smile, not the careful expression she had perfected for Clayton's social gatherings. Outside, Cassian paused on the porch, looking back toward the guest room window. In the space of a single conversation, his carefully ordered life had shifted. He had offered sanctuary to strangers before, but never to someone whose presence would inevitably bring conflict to his door. Yet something about Mara Ellis's quiet courage had touched a part of his heart he thought permanently closed. Elena joined him on the porch, following his gaze. "She's stronger than she knows. She'll need to be. Clayton Blackwood won't give up easily." "Neither will you," Elena said with the confidence of someone who had watched Cassian face down cattle rustlers, crooked land agents, and a dozen other threats over the years. "This ranch has weathered worse storms. This feels different. More personal." Eleanor studied his profile, noting the set of his shoulders and the way his hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. "Different how? I can't explain it. But I know this. No woman should have to choose between safety and freedom. If she wants both, she'll have them here." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the ranch in brilliant clarity, both Cassian and Mara found themselves standing at the threshold of something neither had expected. For her, it was the possibility of a life without fear. For him, it was the chance to discover that some risks were worth taking, even when the cost couldn't be calculated in advance. The peaceful morning held its secrets close, giving no hint of the challenges that would soon test every conviction they held about strength, love, and the price of protecting what mattered most. 3 weeks passed, in a rhythm that Mara had never known, days measured by the gentle needs of her body and the baby she carried, rather than by Clayton's unpredictable moods. She had begun helping Elena with lighter household tasks, finding purpose in simple acts like folding linens and organizing the pantry. Her hands, once soft from a life of enforced idleness, began to show the honest calluses of useful work. Cassian had kept a respectful distance, but their paths crossed naturally throughout each day. Morning coffee on the porch became an unspoken tradition, where they shared observations about the weather, the cattle, and the small dramas of ranch life. She learned that he read voraciously, everything from agricultural journals to Shakespeare, and that he had taught himself Spanish to better communicate with many of his workers. On this particular morning, the October air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Mara wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she watched Cassian working with a young stallion in the corral. His movements were patient and confident, speaking to the animal in low, soothing tones that gradually calmed its nervous energy. "He's got the gift," Elena said, joining Mara on the porch with 2 steaming cups. "Animals trust him instinctively, people too, mostly." "Mostly? There are some folks who find his success threatening. A man who builds something from nothing, treats his workers fairly, and doesn't owe favors to the right families. That makes certain people uncomfortable." Mara understood. Clayton had often spoken contemptuously of upstarts who dared to prosper without paying proper tribute to established power structures. Success achieved through merit rather than manipulation was something he couldn't comprehend. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the main road. A lone rider approached at a steady pace, sitting tall in his saddle, with the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering important messages. He wore a clean black suit and carried himself with the formality of town business. Cassian emerged from the corral, his attention immediately focused on the visitor. Something in the rider's posture put Mara on edge, a tension that spoke of unwelcome news rather than casual business. "Mrs. Holt," the rider called out, mistaking Mara for the lady of the house. "I have a message for the woman staying here." Official business from Mr. Clayton Blackwood. The blood drained from Mara's face. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it struck her like a physical blow. Beside her, Elena's hand found her arm, offering steady support. Cassian approached the porch, his gray eyes hard with protective instinct. "I'm Cassian Holt. This is my ranch. State your business." The messenger's expression shifted as he realized his mistake, but his tone remained formally polite. "Mr. Holt, I represent Mr. Clayton Blackwood of Buffalo Creek. I'm here to deliver a message to his wife, Mrs. Mara Blackwood, who we understand is currently residing here." "Mrs. Ellis is a guest in my home," Cassian replied, his voice level, but carrying unmistakable steel. "If you have something to say, you can say it to me." The messenger looked between Cassian and Mara, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he had walked into. "Sir, my instructions were specific. The message is for Mrs. Blackwood personally." Mara found her voice, though it came out steadier than she felt. "I'll hear what my husband has to say." The messenger reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, heavy cream paper with Clayton's distinctive family crest pressed into red wax. "Mr. Blackwood instructed me to wait for a reply." With hands that trembled only slightly, Mara broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Clayton's handwriting was as precise and controlled as everything else about him, but she could sense the fury beneath the formal words. "My dear wife, your extended absence has become a source of concern for your family and friends. While I understand that expectant mothers sometimes experience unusual emotions, your current behavior reflects poorly on both our family name and my business interests. I have been patient with this episode of hysteria, but that patience has reached its limit. You will return home immediately, or I will be forced to take legal action to reclaim my property and protect my unborn child from the influences of strangers. Be aware that your continued defiance affects not only our household, but also those who have unwisely chosen to interfere in our private family matters. Mr. Holt's mining operations depend upon permits and agreements that could be subject to review should this situation continue. I expect you home within 3 days. A carriage will be sent to collect you on Thursday morning. Do not disappoint me further. Your husband, Clayton Blackwood." The letter shook in Mara's hands as she read it twice, each word designed to wound and intimidate. Clayton had always been skilled at wielding threats like surgical instruments, cutting precisely where they would cause the most damage. "What does he say?" Cassian asked quietly. Mara looked up, seeing Elena's concerned face and Cassian's steady strength. Behind them stood the ranch that had become her sanctuary, the place where she had begun to remember what safety felt like. The contrast between Clayton's world and this one had never been starker. He wants me to return in 3 days. He's threatening to use his influence against your business if I don't comply." Cassian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle squaring of shoulders that spoke of decisions being made. "What do you want to do?" The question caught the messenger off guard. In his experience, husbands demanded and wives obeyed. The idea that a woman's desires might factor into such decisions was foreign to him. Mara began, then stopped. What did she want? For 7 months of marriage, she had trained herself not to want anything beyond basic survival. Now, faced with a direct question about her own desires, she felt the magnitude of the choice before her. "I want my child to grow up in a place where love is expressed through kindness rather than control," she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to wake up each morning without wondering what I might do wrong that day. I want to be valued for who I am, not what I represent." "Then you'll stay," Cassian said simply. The messenger shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sir, perhaps you don't understand the full implications." "I understand perfectly." Cassian's voice cut through the man's protest. "Mr. Blackwood is welcome to review any business arrangements he chooses. He'll find everything in order and properly documented. As for his other threats, he's welcome to test the strength of his influence against the truth." "And what reply should I give Mr. Blackwood?" the messenger asked, clearly hoping to complete his unpleasant task and return to town. Mara stood slowly, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "Tell my husband that I am exactly where I choose to be, surrounded by people who understand that a woman is not property to be reclaimed at will." The messenger nodded curtly, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away, carrying news that would likely send Clayton into one of his controlled rages. Mara watched until he disappeared from view, then sank back into her chair as the full implications of her choice settled upon her. "He won't accept this quietly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clayton's entire sense of himself depends on maintaining control. He'll see this as a challenge to everything he believes about his place in the world." Cassian moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "Let me worry about Clayton Blackwood. Your job is to take care of yourself and your baby. You don't understand. He has connections throughout the territory. Judges, sheriffs, business partners. He can make life very difficult for anyone who crosses him. And he doesn't understand what he's dealing with here." Elena's voice carried a fierce protectiveness that surprised even Mara. "This ranch has weathered claim jumpers, cattle thieves, and politicians trying to steal what doesn't belong to them. Your husband might have influence, but influence only goes so far when it comes up against people who know right from wrong." Over the following hours, word of the confrontation spread among the ranch hands with the swift efficiency of men who understood that their loyalty might soon be tested. Jake Morrison, Cassian's foreman for 8 years, sought him out as the afternoon shadows grew long. "Boss, the boys want you to know, whatever's coming, we're with you. Mrs. Ellis has been nothing but kind to everyone she's met, and any man who would threaten a pregnant woman isn't worth the dirt on our boots." Similar sentiments echoed from the other men throughout the day. Cookie, the ranch cook whose real name nobody remembered, made a point of preparing Mara's favorite soup for dinner. Young Billy Santos, barely 18 and full of righteous indignation, offered to ride to Buffalo Creek and explain things to Mr. Blackwood personally. Even the more reserved hands made their support known through small gestures. A touched hat brim, a respectful nod, and extra attention to the security of the ranch buildings. That evening, as Mara helped Elena clear the dinner dishes, she found herself overwhelmed by the simple kindness surrounding her. These people owed her nothing, yet they had chosen to stand between her and Clayton's wrath. "I don't deserve this," she said, tears threatening to spill over. "Child, kindness isn't about deserving. It's about recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to provide it." Elena's hands stilled on the dish towel. "Besides, you've given us something too." "What could I possibly have given you?" "Purpose. Mr. Cassian has been drifting since his family died, going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. Taking care of you has awakened something in him that's been sleeping too long. As if summoned by their conversation, Cassian appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Mara, could I speak with you privately?" They walked to the porch, where the evening stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The air held the promise of frost, and Mara pulled her shawl closer as they settled into the wooden chairs that had become their regular meeting. "Your place. I've been thinking about what comes next," Cassian began, his voice thoughtful. "Clayton will escalate. Men like him always do when their authority is challenged. I know, and I know what that could cost you. Perhaps I should—" "No!" The word came out more forcefully than he intended, and he gentled his tone. "I'm not suggesting you should leave. I'm suggesting we need to be prepared for whatever he throws at us. What did you have in mind? First, practical matters. I'm bringing in additional men to help with ranch security. I also want to teach you to handle a firearm, just in case." Mara nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his preparations. And second, Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I want you to know that my offer of protection isn't temporary. When your baby is born, when this conflict with Clayton is resolved, whatever the outcome, you'll always have a place here if you want it." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. Mara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the shawl around her shoulders. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because in 3 weeks, you've reminded me what it feels like to have someone to protect, not out of duty or obligation, but because—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much too soon. "Because some people are worth fighting for." Above them, the stars emerged one by one, bearing witness to the moment when two damaged souls recognized in each other the possibility of healing. Neither spoke the word love. It was too soon, too fragile, too precious to risk with premature naming. But something had shifted between them, a recognition that their fates were now intertwined in ways that went beyond mere shelter and gratitude. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound wild and free. Mara placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's responsive movement, and wondered if her child would grow up understanding that freedom was worth fighting for, and that the strongest people were often those who chose to protect rather than dominate. The morning would bring new challenges, she knew. Clayton's response to her defiance would be swift and calculated to cause maximum damage. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet strength of the ranch and the man who had chosen to stand with her, Mara Ellis allowed herself to believe that some battles could be won, and some forms of love were strong enough to weather any storm. Touch. Thursday morning that Clayton had designated for Mara's return came and went without the promised carriage. Instead, it brought Dr. Samuel Richardson, a weathered man in his 60s who had been delivering babies and mending broken bones across the territory for 30 years. His arrival at the ranch was not unexpected. Cassian had sent word requesting regular checkups for Mara as her pregnancy progressed. "Everything looks excellent, my dear," Dr. Richardson announced after his examination, packing his instruments back into his worn leather bag. "The baby is positioned well. Heartbeat is strong, and you're healthier than when I first met you 3 weeks ago." It was true. The constant tension that had lived in Mara's shoulders had begun to ease, and the dark circles under her eyes had faded. Good food, restful sleep, and the absence of fear had worked their own kind of medicine. "How much longer?" Mara asked, adjusting her dress as she sat up on the edge of the bed. 6 weeks, perhaps 7. First babies often take their time deciding when to make their entrance. The doctor's eyes crinkled with practiced kindness. "Are you experiencing any particular discomforts?" "Only the usual. Some back pain, difficulty sleeping when the baby decides to practice his dancing at midnight." "His dancing?" Dr. Richardson raised an eyebrow with amusement. Mara blushed slightly. "I've been thinking of the baby as a boy. I don't know why. Mothers often sense these things, and you mentioned his dancing. Active babies usually grow into strong, healthy children. As they made their way downstairs, the doctor paused to admire the wooden rocking horse that had appeared in the front parlor. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Smooth curves, carved from what appeared to be cherry wood, with a flowing mane and gentle expression that invited touch. "Beautiful work," Dr. Richardson commented. "Local craftsman?" "Mr. Holt made it," Mara replied, unable to keep the warmth from her voice. "He's been working on it in the evenings." The doctor filed this information away with the practiced discretion of a man who had witnessed many forms of human kindness over the years. In his experience, men didn't carve rocking horses for babies unless their hearts were already invested in the child's future. They found Cassian on the front porch, discussing ranch business with Jake Morrison. Both men straightened as Mara, and the doctor emerged from the house. "How are our patients, doctor?" Cassian asked, his concern evident despite his casual tone. "Mother and baby are both thriving. Mrs. Ellis is gaining appropriate weight, and her color is much improved since my last visit." Dr. Richardson set his bag down and accepted the cup of coffee Elena offered. "I do have some concerns about the approaching delivery, however." "What kind of concerns?" Cassian's voice sharpened with protective instinct. "Nothing medical, Mr. Holt, but I've been hearing talk in town. There are rumors that Mr. Blackwood is pursuing legal remedies to what he sees as an unfortunate situation." Jake Morrison spat into the dust with disgust. "Legal remedies? That's a fancy way of saying he's trying to buy himself a judge." "What kind of legal remedies?" Mara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Richardson chose his words carefully. "There's talk of a petition to declare you mentally incompetent due to the stresses of pregnancy. Such a ruling would place you and your child under your husband's legal guardianship, regardless of your personal wishes." The words hit Mara like a physical blow. She had heard of such cases, women whose families or husbands had them declared mentally unfit to control their own lives. Once such a ruling was made, a woman became little more than a legal ward, with no right to make decisions about her own future or that of her children. "Can he do that?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "With the right judge and sufficient influence, I'm afraid it's possible." Dr. Richardson's expression was grim. "However, such petitions require evidence of mental incompetence. Given that you're clearly rational, articulate, and making reasonable decisions about your health and welfare, any honest examination would find no grounds for such a ruling." "But honest is the key word there," Cassian said quietly. "And honesty can be expensive when you're dealing with men like Clayton Blackwood." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention to the main road. 4 riders approached at a steady pace, not the rushed gallop of urgent business, but the measured advance of men with official authority. Leading the group was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Cassian had known for 6 years and generally respected despite their political differences. Behind him rode 3 deputies, including one Cassian didn't recognize. A lean man with calculating eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to using violence as a tool of persuasion. "Mr. Holt," Sheriff Bradley called out as the group reached the yard. "Afternoon, Dr. Ma'am." He touched his hat to Mara with the courtesy due any lady, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Sheriff," Cassian responded, stepping forward slightly to position himself between the lawmen and Mara. "What brings you out this way?" "Official business, I'm afraid. I have a court order here requiring Mrs. Mara Blackwood to submit to a medical examination to determine her mental fitness." Sheriff Bradley withdrew a folded document from his jacket, his reluctance to deliver it evident in his careful movements. Dr. Richardson stood immediately. "Sheriff, I've just completed a thorough examination of Mrs. Ellis. Her mental state is completely sound. With respect, Doctor, the court has appointed its own physician for this evaluation." The sheriff's discomfort was growing more apparent. Dr. Nathaniel Cruz from Buffalo Creek has been designated to conduct the examination. Mara felt the world tilt slightly around her. Dr. Cruz was Clayton's personal physician and longtime friend, a man who would find whatever mental deficiency Clayton required him to find. On whose petition was this order issued? Cassian demanded, though they all knew the answer. Mr. Clayton Blackwood, in his capacity as concerned husband and father-to-be. The petition cites Mrs. Blackwood's recent erratic behavior and abandonment of her marital home as evidence of mental distress requiring professional evaluation. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. And what happens if Mrs. Ellis refuses this examination? The unknown deputy's hand moved to his own weapon, but Sheriff Bradley raised a cautioning gesture. Now, Jake, let's keep this civil. Mrs. Blackwood, the order gives you a choice. You can submit to the examination voluntarily, or Dr. Cruz can conduct it under sheriff's supervision. Meaning she has no choice at all, Elena said, her voice tight with anger. Meaning the law requires compliance one way or another, the sheriff replied, his tone apologetic but firm. Mara stood slowly, her hand pressed against her belly as if to shield her unborn child from the ugliness of adult conflicts. And if Dr. Cruz finds me mentally unfit, then you'll be remanded to your husband's custody for appropriate care and treatment. The trap was beautifully constructed, Mara realized. Clayton had maneuvered her into a position where resistance would be portrayed as further evidence of mental instability, while compliance would almost certainly result in a predetermined finding of incompetence. When is this examination scheduled? Cassian asked. Dr. Cruz is waiting in Buffalo Creek. We can escort Mrs. Blackwood there now, or she can present herself at his office by tomorrow morning. She'll need time to prepare, Dr. Richardson interjected. Expectant mothers require careful handling, especially during stressful situations. Sheriff Bradley nodded gratefully at the doctor's intervention. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock would be acceptable. After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, the group on the porch stood in heavy silence. The legal trap Clayton had constructed was closing around them, and everyone present understood the likely outcome of any examination conducted by his personal physician. There has to be something we can do, Jake Morrison said, breaking the silence. Some way to challenge this. The order came from Judge Harrison in Buffalo Creek, Dr. Richardson said thoughtfully. A man whose political aspirations have always exceeded his moral convictions. However, the territorial courts in Cheyenne operate under different influences. You're thinking of an appeal? Cassian asked. I'm thinking of prevention. If we can document Mrs. Ellis's complete mental competence before tomorrow's examination, it becomes much harder for Dr. Cruz to claim otherwise without contradicting established medical opinion. Hope flickered in Mara's chest for the first time since the sheriff's arrival. How would we do that? Detailed examination and documentation by an independent physician. Fortunately, Dr. Margaret Sinclair is currently visiting the Morrison Ranch to treat Jake's mother. She's one of the few female physicians in the territory trained at Johns Hopkins, and her professional reputation is unassailable. Jake's face brightened. Doc Sinclair's been staying with us for 3 days. Mother's been improving steadily under her care. Would she be willing to examine me? Mara asked. Dr. Sinclair has strong opinions about women's rights and the misuse of medical authority for political purposes, Dr. Richardson said with a slight smile. I believe she would be very interested in preventing an injustice. Within 2 hours, Dr. Margaret Sinclair arrived at the ranch in her own buggy, a woman of perhaps 45 with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She spent 3 hours with Mara, conducting not just a medical examination, but extensive conversations about her background, education, and current circumstances. Mrs. Ellis, Dr. Sinclair announced as she completed her documentation, you are one of the most mentally sound individuals I've encountered in recent memory. Your decision to leave an abusive situation while pregnant shows remarkable courage. and clear thinking. Any suggestion of mental incompetence would be not only medically inaccurate, but professionally unethical. As evening approached, Cassian found Mara sitting in the parlor, gently rocking the wooden horse he had carved. The motion seemed to calm both her and the baby, whose movements had been unusually active throughout the stressful day. "It's beautiful work," she said without looking up. "The expression is so gentle, so patient, like someone who would wait forever for the right child to love." Cassian settled into the chair across from her, noting how the lamplight softened her features and highlighted the growing fullness of her pregnancy. "I keep imagining a little boy with your eyes, learning to ride his first horse. And if it's a girl, then I'll carve her a different horse, one that's as spirited and determined as her mother." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. They were talking about a future that assumed his continued presence in her child's life, a future that depended on surviving Clayton's legal assault. "Cassian," Mara said softly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these weeks have been the happiest of my adult life. You've shown me what it means to be valued, protected, and—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much too soon. "Loved?" he finished gently. "Yes, loved." The word felt both foreign and familiar on her lips. "I didn't know such kindness existed between a man and woman. It does exist, and it's not going anywhere, regardless of what Clayton or his bought judges try to do." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was approaching quickly. Soon the ranch would be isolated by snow, cut off from the outside world for months at a time. It would be a natural fortress, but it would also be a trap if Clayton chose to wait for spring to make his final move. "What do you think will happen tomorrow?" Mara asked. "I think Dr. Sinclair's documentation will make it very difficult for anyone to claim you're mentally unfit. And I think Clayton is about to learn that some battles can't be won with money and influence alone." As they prepared for bed, both Cassian and Mara carried the weight of the approaching confrontation, but they also carried something else, a growing certainty that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The rocking horse stood silent in the parlor, waiting patiently for the child who would soon need its gentle comfort, a symbol of hope carved from timber that had weathered many storms and emerged stronger for the testing. The morning of the examination arrived grey and cold, with clouds that promised the season's first snow. Mara dressed carefully in her finest remaining dress, a deep blue wool that had been let out to accommodate her changing figure. Around her throat, she wore her mother's locket, a small silver piece that contained the only photograph she had of her family. Elena had braided her hair in an elaborate style that spoke of respectability and careful attention to appearance. "You look like the educated lady you are," she pronounced with satisfaction. "No honest person could mistake you for anything but a woman of sound mind and good breeding." The ride to Buffalo Creek took 2 hours, with Cassian driving the wagon, and Dr. Sinclair following in her own buggy. Jake Morrison and 2 other ranch hands rode alongside as escorts, their presence both protective and symbolic. Whatever happened today, Mara would not face it alone. Buffalo Creek had grown considerably since Mara's last visit, fed by the wealth flowing from Clayton's various enterprises. New buildings lined the main street, and the sidewalks bustled with the kind of purposeful activity that spoke of a town confident in its prosperity. It was also, Mara noticed, a town where many eyes turned to watch their small procession with curious interest. Dr. Cruz maintained his practice in a substantial brick building near the center of town, with brass nameplate and spotless windows that proclaimed professional success. As they approached, Mara caught sight of Clayton's carriage parked discreetly around the corner, close enough for him to observe the proceedings, but far enough away to maintain the pretense that this was an independent medical evaluation. "Remember," Dr. Sinclair said as they prepared to enter the building, "answer all questions directly and honestly. Don't volunteer information beyond what's asked, but don't appear evasive either. You have nothing to hide and every reason to be confident." Dr. Nathaniel Cruz proved to be a man in his 50s, with the kind of precisely groomed appearance that suggested great attention to social standing. His office was appointed with expensive furniture and medical instruments that gleamed with polished authority. When Mara entered, accompanied by Dr. Sinclair as her medical advocate, Dr. Cruz's expression tightened with barely concealed annoyance. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said with formal politeness, "I wasn't expecting you to bring another physician to what is intended as a private medical consultation." "Dr. Sinclair is here at my request," Mara replied calmly. "As the Territorial Medical Board allows, I've chosen to have independent medical representation during any examination that might affect my legal status." Dr. Cruz clearly hadn't expected this level of preparation, and his carefully planned approach began to show cracks. "Very well, please be seated." What followed was 2 hours of the most invasive questioning Mara had ever experienced. Dr. Cruz probed every aspect of her decision to leave Clayton, her current living arrangements, and her plans for the future. His questions were designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as evidence of instability, poor judgment, or emotional imbalance. "And you believe it was rational to abandon your husband's home while pregnant, with no means of support?" Dr. Cruz asked, his pen poised over his notes. "I believed it was necessary to protect myself and my unborn child from ongoing physical and emotional harm," Mara replied steadily. "Removing oneself from a dangerous situation is generally considered evidence of sound judgment rather than mental instability." Dr. Sinclair nodded approvingly at this response, while Dr. Cruz frowned and scratched out something in his notes. "You are currently residing with a man who is not your husband. Some might consider this arrangement morally questionable. I'm residing as a guest in a household that includes a female housekeeper who serves as chaperone, along with numerous other residents and workers. The arrangement is both proper and temporary, existing only until I can establish independent living arrangements after my child is born." The questioning continued in this vein, with Dr. Cruz becoming increasingly frustrated as Mara's responses demonstrated clear thinking, reasonable planning, and a firm grasp of her circumstances. When he attempted to steer the conversation toward intimate details of her marriage, Dr. Sinclair intervened. "Dr. Cruz, unless you can establish the medical relevance of such questions to Mrs. Ellis's mental state, I must object to this line of inquiry as both inappropriate and professionally unethical. I am attempting to understand the full context of Mrs. Blackwood's recent decisions," Dr. Cruz replied stiffly. "The context is that Mrs. Ellis made a difficult but rational choice to protect herself and her child from documented abuse. Her decision-making process has been consistent, well-reasoned, and appropriate to her circumstances. I see no evidence of mental impairment or emotional instability." When the examination finally concluded, Dr. Cruz's demeanor had shifted from confident authority to barely contained irritation. His predetermined conclusions had been challenged by Mara's obvious competence and Dr. Sinclair's professional oversight. "I'll need several days to compile my findings," Dr. Cruz announced, clearly hoping to find some way to deliver the verdict Clayton expected, despite the evidence to the contrary. "Of course," Dr. Sinclair replied pleasantly. "I'll be submitting my own evaluation to the Territorial Medical Board, as well as to Judge Morrison in Cheyenne, within 24 hours. Professional standards require prompt reporting when we encounter potential misuse of medical authority for non-medical purposes." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Dr. Cruz understood that his professional reputation was now at stake, and that any obviously biased findings would be scrutinized by medical authorities with no reason to favor Clayton's interests. As they prepared to leave Buffalo Creek, Cassian suggested they stop at the hotel restaurant for lunch. It was a decision that proved fortuitous, as it brought them into contact with several residents who had known Mara during her marriage to Clayton. Mrs. Blackwood called out Sarah Mitchell, wife of the local banker. "How wonderful to see you, looking so well. We've all been so concerned since—" She paused delicately, clearly having heard rumors about the marital difficulties. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm doing very well indeed. And the baby? Everything is progressing. Normally? Yes, thank you. Dr. Richardson has been very pleased with my health." All the conversations followed similar patterns, with townspeople who had observed Mara during her marriage expressing genuine concern for her welfare and obvious relief at her improved appearance. Several commented on how much healthier and happier she looked, observations that would make their way through the town's gossip networks and undermine any claims of mental deterioration. The most significant encounter came as they were preparing to leave the restaurant. Thomas Whitman, editor of the Buffalo Creek Gazette, approached their table with the careful manner of a man weighing his words. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, using the name she had chosen to reclaim, "I wonder if you might have a moment to speak with me privately." Cassian's protective instincts immediately sharpened, but Mara placed a calming hand on his arm. "Of course, Mr. Whitman." They stepped outside onto the restaurant's porch, where Whitman glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Ma'am, I want you to know that there are people in this town who've been watching the situation with your husband for some time. We've seen things, heard things that concern us greatly." "What kind of things?" "Business dealings that skirt the edge of legality, treatment of workers that goes beyond firm management into actual cruelty, and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There have been other women over the years who've sought help, though none with your courage to actually leave." Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching winter weather. "Other women? Servants who've come to work in the Blackwood household and left within days, sometimes with unexplained injuries. Business associates' wives who've made excuses to avoid social gatherings at your home. There's been talk, Mrs. Ellis, but no one has been willing to speak publicly until now. And now there's a growing sentiment that someone needs to stand up to Clayton Blackwood's abuse of power. Your situation has crystallized feelings that have been building for years." When they rejoined the others, Mara's expression had changed in ways that Cassian immediately recognized. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a growing awareness that she was not alone in her struggle against Clayton's tyranny. During the ride back to the ranch, Dr. Sinclair shared her own impressions of the day's events. "Dr. Cruz will find it very difficult to justify a finding of mental incompetence. Your responses were textbook examples of rational thought and appropriate emotional processing. Moreover, the community's obvious support for your decision provides additional evidence of your sound judgment." "What happens next?" Mara asked. "Clayton will likely escalate again. Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully, especially public." "Defeat? He'll be looking for other avenues of pressure." Cassian's hands tightened on the wagon reins. "Let him escalate. This ranch has faced down threats before." As they approached the ranch in the late afternoon, they found Jake Morrison waiting, with news that confirmed Dr. Sinclair's prediction. "Boss, we've had visitors while you were gone. 3 different men, all claiming to be prospective cattle buyers, but asking too many questions about our security arrangements and not enough about our livestock. Clayton's men." "That'd be my guess. Professional types, not local talent. They were polite enough, but they were definitely taking inventory." That evening, as Mara helped Elena prepare dinner, she found herself reflecting on the day's revelations. The examination had gone better than hoped, but it had also clarified the broader scope of Clayton's influence and the risk she represented to his carefully constructed reputation. "Elena," she said quietly, "do you think I've brought too much danger to this place?" The older woman paused in her chopping of vegetables, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Child, danger was already here. Men like your husband create danger wherever they go, for everyone around them. The only choice is whether to face it or run from it. And you think we should face it? I think some battles choose us, whether We want them or not, and I think you've already shown more courage than most people find in a lifetime." Later that night, as Mara prepared for bed, she examined her mother's locket in the lamplight. The photograph inside showed a young girl with bright eyes and an eager smile, herself at age 8, before the world had taught her that happiness was something to be rationed carefully. She thought about Thomas Whitman's words, about other women who had suffered under Clayton's control, but lacked the resources or courage to escape. Her decision to leave had been born from desperation and the desire to protect her unborn child. But it had become something larger, a stand that might inspire others to find their own courage. Outside her window, she could see Cassian checking the security of the barn and corrals, his movements systematic and thorough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. Clayton's legal assault had been blunted but not defeated, and his other forms of pressure were only beginning. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her, Mara Ellis felt something she had almost forgotten existed, the strength that came from being truly supported, truly valued, and truly loved. Her hand moved to her belly, where her child rested peacefully, unaware of the battles being fought for his future. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered. "You're going to be born into a world where people fight for what's right, where love means protection rather than possession, and where courage is measured not by the absence of fear, but by choosing to do right despite it." The first snowflakes began to fall as she extinguished her lamp, each one catching the moonlight like a promise that winter would eventually give way to spring, and that some forms of love were strong enough to weather any storm. The first snow of winter arrived 3 days after the examination, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and isolating. Mara stood at her bedroom window, watching the flakes swirl in the wind when the first labor pain struck, a deep, gripping sensation that stole her breath and sent her hand flying to the window frame for support. "Too early," she whispered to herself, counting the weeks in her head. The baby wasn't due for another month, but her body seemed to have its own timeline. A second pain followed 15 minutes later, then another, and Mara realized with a mixture of terror and anticipation that her child had chosen this snowy November morning to make his entrance into the world. "Elena!" she called, her voice carrying more urgency than she intended. Within moments, Elena appeared in the doorway, took one look at Mara's face, and immediately understood the situation. "How long have the pains been coming?" "About an hour." "They're getting stronger." Elena's expression shifted into the calm efficiency of a woman who had assisted with dozens of births over the years. "We need to get word to Dr. Richardson, though I doubt he'll make it through this snow. Let me find Mr. Cassian." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and increasing intensity. Dr. Richardson had indeed been unable to reach the ranch. His buggy stopped by drifts that were already knee-deep and growing higher. But Elena proved to be an experienced midwife, and Cassian surprised everyone, including himself, by remaining calm and helpful throughout the ordeal. "I've delivered plenty of foals and calves," he said, with a shaky attempt at humor when Elena asked him to assist. "How different can this be?" "Very different," Elena replied dryly. "But the basics are the same. New life wants to come into the world, and our job is to help it along." As the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified outside, the ranch house became a cocoon of warmth and anticipation. Jake Morrison and the other hands maintained respectful distance, but their concern was evident in the way they found excuses to check on the house's heating and security. Cookie prepared an endless supply of hot water and clean linens, muttering prayers in Spanish under his breath. The baby chose to arrive just as the winter sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. When his first cry filled the room, Mara felt a transformation, unlike anything she had ever experienced, a fierce, protective love that was both overwhelming and empowering. "A son!" Elena announced with satisfaction, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Mara's chest. Small but strong, just like his mother, Cassian stood at the foot of the bed, his face showing a mixture of awe and tenderness that made Mara's heart catch. When Elena asked if he wanted to hold the baby, his hands trembled slightly as he accepted the tiny bundle. "Hello, little man," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Watching Cassian hold her son, Mara felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this man was already the father her child deserved, regardless of biology. The baby seemed to sense it too, settling peacefully in Cassian's strong arms with complete trust. "What will you call him?" Elena asked. Mara looked up at Cassian, seeing the hope in his eyes that he was trying to hide. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Thomas Holt." The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas, after Cassian's beloved brother. Holt, after the man who had chosen to protect them both. It was a declaration that went beyond simple gratitude. It was the claiming of a family that had been built on love rather than obligation. "Thomas," Cassian repeated, his voice wondering. "Thomas Holt." The baby opened his eyes then, dark blue like his mother's, and seemed to look directly at the man holding him. In that moment, the bonds of chosen family were forged more surely than any legal document could have accomplished. Dr. Richardson arrived 2 days later, having finally managed to make his way through the snowdrifts with the help of a borrowed sleigh. His examination of both mother and baby confirmed what Elena had already determined. Despite his early arrival, Thomas was healthy and strong. "Remarkable," the doctor pronounced, weighing the baby with practiced hands. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Small but perfectly formed. His early arrival was probably nature's way of ensuring he was born in safety, surrounded by people who love him. As word of Thomas's birth spread throughout the territory, it brought an unexpected response. Neighbors who had been watching the situation with Clayton began arriving at the ranch with gifts and offers of support. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch brought hand-knitted baby clothes. The Hendersons delivered a cradle that had been used by 3 generations of their family. Even some residents of Buffalo Creek made the difficult journey to pay their respects and offer assistance. "It's remarkable," Jake Morrison observed to Cassian as they watched another group of visitors departing. "I've never seen the community rally around anyone like this." "They're not just supporting Mara and the baby," Cassian replied thoughtfully. "They're making a statement about what kind of community they want to live in. A place where women and children are protected, not treated as property." The most significant visitor arrived on Thomas's 5th day of life. Judge Harold Morrison from Cheyenne, Jake's uncle and one of the most respected jurists in the territory, had made the difficult winter journey specifically to meet with Mara. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from her in the parlor, "I've been following your situation with great interest. Dr. Sinclair's report on your mental competency examination made for fascinating reading. I hope it was satisfactory, Your Honor. More than satisfactory. It was damning for anyone who might claim you're mentally unfit. However, I'm here about a different matter entirely." Judge Morrison pulled out a leather portfolio. "I'm prepared to offer you something that might interest you, a legal divorce from Clayton Blackwood on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." Mara felt her heart skip. "Is such a thing possible? Under territorial law, yes, particularly given the documented evidence of abuse and his threats against you and your child." Dr. Sinclair's report, combined with witness statements from several Buffalo Creek residents, provides compelling grounds for dissolution of the marriage. What would that mean for Thomas? Full custody would be awarded to you, with no parental rights reserved for Mr. Blackwood. Legally, you would be free to remarry, and your new husband could formally adopt the child. The judge's eyes moved meaningfully toward the nursery, where Cassian could be heard humming a lullaby to Thomas. The implication was clear. The legal path was being prepared for the family that had already formed in their hearts. That evening, as Mara nursed Thomas while Cassian sat nearby reading from Hamlet, she found herself overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her circumstances. 2 weeks ago, she had been facing a forced mental competency examination. Now she held her healthy son while discussing divorce proceedings that would give her complete freedom. "Cassian," she said softly, not wanting to wake the baby. "Judge Morrison's offer. What do you think? I think you should do whatever feels right to you, but I also think you deserve to be free to make your own choices about your future. And what about my future do you think I should choose?" Cassian closed his book and looked at her directly, his grey eyes steady and sure. "I think you should choose happiness. I think you should choose a life where you're valued and protected and loved. I think you should choose a home where your son can grow up knowing what it means to be cherished. And do you think such a life is possible? I know it is. The question is whether you're ready to claim it." Mara looked down at Thomas, who had fallen asleep in her arms with the complete trust that only babies possess. His tiny fist was wrapped around her finger, holding on with surprising strength for such a small being. "I've been thinking about what kind of man I want him to become," she said quietly. "I want him to be strong but gentle, confident but not arrogant, protective of those who need it, but never using his strength to intimidate or control. Those are good qualities to hope for. I want him to have a father who can teach him those things, not just tell him about them, but show him through example." Cassian's breath caught slightly. "Mara, I want him to grow up on this ranch, learning to ride horses and care for animals and understand the value of honest work. I want him to know that love means choosing to stay, choosing to protect, choosing to sacrifice for others when necessary." "And what do you want for yourself?" Mara looked up at him, seeing the love in his face that he had been too careful to speak aloud. "I want to wake up every morning knowing that I'm valued for who I am, not what I represent. I want to go to sleep every night feeling safe and cherished. I want to be part of building something good and lasting and true. Those things are here if you want them. I know they are. The question is whether you're ready to claim them too." Cassian stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, his hand covering hers where it rested on Thomas's back. "Mara Ellis, I love you. Not because you need protection, not because I feel sorry for you, but because you're brave and kind and strong in ways that humble me. I love your son because he's part of you, and because I want to be the father he deserves. And I love you, Cassian Holt, because you showed me what love actually looks like. You showed me that a strong man protects rather than dominates, that real power comes from choosing to use your strength for others." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine silence. But inside the warm house, 3 people who had found each other through pain and courage were creating something new, a family built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than law, on hope rather than fear. Thomas stirred in his mother's arms, opening his dark blue eyes to look up at the 2 people who would shape his understanding of what love meant. In that moment, watching his tiny face recognize the voices that had already become familiar and dear, Mara Ellis knew that some gifts come disguised as disasters, and that the greatest love stories often begin with the courage to walk away from everything you thought you wanted in order to find everything you actually needed. The silver pocket watch that had belonged to Cassian's brother sat on the mantelpiece, its steady ticking marking time in a house where past sorrows were being transformed into future joy. And in the cradle beside the fireplace, the woven blanket that Elena had made from the ranch's own wool waited to wrap a child who would grow up knowing that he was wanted, chosen, and deeply loved by people who understood that the strongest families are often those that choose each other. 2 weeks after Thomas's birth, Cassian found Mara in the nursery just before dawn, sitting in the rocking chair with their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. The early morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows cast everything in a soft, golden glow that made the scene feel almost ethereal. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, settling into the chair Elena had moved into the room for just such moments. "I've been thinking," Mara replied, her voice quiet to avoid waking the baby, "about Judge Morrison's offer, about the future, about what we're building here. And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I want to marry you, not just for protection, not just for Thomas's legitimacy, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you." She looked up at him, her dark blue eyes steady and sure. "Cassian Holt, will you marry me?" The proposal, coming from her instead of him, caught Cassian off guard in the most wonderful way. For a moment, he could only stare at her, this brave woman who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich and meaningful. "Yes," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll marry you and adopt Thomas and spend every day of my life making sure you both know how much you're loved. Even knowing that Clayton will never accept this quietly, even knowing that marrying me might bring more trouble to your door, especially knowing that some things are worth fighting for, Mara. Some things are worth any risk." Thomas stirred, in his mother's arms, making the small sounds that indicated he was waking up and would soon want to be fed. But for a moment longer, the three of them sat in perfect contentment, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered ranch and planning a future that seemed both fragile and unshakable. The wedding preparations began immediately, with Eleanor taking charge of the arrangements with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. The ceremony would be simple, held in the ranch house parlor, with Judge Morrison officiating, but every detail would be perfect. "We'll need flowers," Elena announced, making lists with characteristic efficiency. "Mrs. Henderson has a greenhouse, where she's been growing winter roses. And Cookie will make the cake, though he keeps insisting he's never made a wedding cake before." "What about a dress?" Mara asked, looking down at her figure, which was still recovering from pregnancy. "I have nothing suitable for a wedding." "Leave that to me," Eleanor said with a mysterious smile. "I have an idea." The idea, it turned out, involved the combined efforts of every woman within a 50-mile radius. Word of the upcoming wedding had spread through the territory's network of ranches and settlements, and what followed was an outpouring of support that overwhelmed Mara with its generosity. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her late daughter's wedding dress, carefully preserved and only needing minor alterations. Sarah Mitchell brought a veil that had been handed down through 3 generations of her family. Other women contributed jewelry, shoes, and accessories until Mara found herself surrounded by more bridal finery than she had ever imagined possessing. "Why are they doing this?" she asked Elena as they sorted through the contributions. "Most of these women barely know me." "They know enough," Elena replied, carefully examining the lace on the borrowed veil. "They know you had the courage to leave an abusive marriage. They know you're building something good here with Mr. Cassian, and they know that some battles affect the whole community, not just the people directly involved." As the wedding preparations continued, life on the ranch took on a festive quality that was new to many of the workers. Cassian had always been a fair and generous employer, but he had also been solitary, focused more on the work than on celebrating life's milestones. Now, with a wedding to plan and a baby to dote on, the entire atmosphere of the place had shifted. Jake Morrison found himself assigned to string lights throughout the house, muttering good-naturedly about ranch foremen who had somehow become wedding decorators. Cookie spent hours perfecting his cake recipe, emerging from the kitchen periodically to announce his latest triumph or disaster to anyone within earshot. 3 layers, he proclaimed proudly to Cassian one evening, with real vanilla and sugar. "Roses, it's going to be the finest cake this territory has ever seen." Even the younger ranch hands threw themselves into the preparations, competing to see who could polish the parlor furniture to the highest shine or arrange the chairs in the most perfect rows. The entire ranch buzzed with anticipation and joy, as if everyone understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious. But beneath the celebration, tension was building. Clayton's response to news of the planned wedding came in the form of increasingly aggressive legal maneuvers and business pressure. 3 of Cassian's cattle contracts were suddenly cancelled without explanation. The bank in Buffalo Creek, where Cassian had maintained accounts for 8 years, sent notice that his loans were being called in for immediate payment. "He's trying to strangle us financially," Jake Morrison observed during one of the evening strategy sessions that had become routine. "Force you into a position where you can't afford to fight him." "Let him try," Cassian replied grimly. "I've got enough cash reserves to weather this storm, and my mines are producing well. Clayton's influence has limits." "What about the wedding? Should we postpone until things settle down?" "Absolutely not. If anything, we should move it up. The sooner Mara and I are legally married, the stronger our position becomes." As if summoned by their conversation, Mara appeared in the doorway with Thomas in her arms. The baby had grown noticeably in his first month of life, and his dark blue eyes now tracked movement and focused on faces with increasing attention. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said, settling into the chair beside Cassian. "I agree about moving up the wedding date. Clayton's pressure is only going to intensify, and I'd rather face it as your wife than as your, what would he call me, your mistress?" "You're not my mistress, you're my partner," Cassian said firmly. "In every way that matters, we're already married. The ceremony is just making it official." "Then let's make it official soon. Judge Morrison can perform the ceremony this weekend if we ask him." The accelerated timeline sent Eleanor into a flurry of even more intense activity, but she pronounced it entirely manageable with the help of their extended community. Messages were sent to confirmed guests, final preparations were rushed, and Cookie went into seclusion with his cake ingredients, emerging only to demand additional eggs from increasingly nervous chickens. 3 days before the now-scheduled wedding, Dr. Richardson arrived with news that cast a shadow over the celebrations. "I'm afraid I bring troubling information," he announced, accepting a cup of coffee and settling heavily into his chair. "There are rumors in Buffalo Creek that Clayton is planning something dramatic for your wedding day." "What kind of something?" Cassian asked, his protective instincts immediately alert. "The specifics are unclear, but there's talk of a large group of men being hired, ostensibly for ranch work, but arriving all at once and heavily armed. The timing seems too coincidental to ignore." Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "He means to disrupt the ceremony, or worse," Dr. Richardson said grimly. "Clayton's business empire is built on the perception that he always gets what he wants. Your successful defiance of his authority threatens that perception. He may see this as his last chance to reassert control. Then we'll be ready for him," Jake Morrison said, with the confidence of a man who had been preparing for exactly this scenario. "We've got good men, good positions, and the advantage of fighting on our own ground." "I won't have our wedding turned into a battlefield," Mara said firmly. "Perhaps we should postpone after all." "No," Cassian said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Clayton has already stolen too much of your life. He's not stealing this too. We'll marry as planned, surrounded by people who love us, and we'll deal with whatever he throws at us." That evening, as they sat together in the parlor with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Mara found herself studying Cassian's profile in the firelight. In the months since her arrival at the ranch, she had watched him grow from a solitary, grieving man into someone filled with purpose and joy. The transformation had been as profound as her own journey from fear to love. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking us in, I mean. Your life was peaceful before Clayton started his campaign against us. My life was empty before you arrived," Cassian replied without hesitation. "I was going through the motions of living without really engaging with life. You and Thomas have given me something to fight for, something to build toward, something to hope for." even if that fight becomes dangerous, especially if it becomes dangerous. Some things are worth any risk, Mara. Love is worth any risk. As if responding to his father's voice, Thomas stirred in his cradle and made the small sounds that indicated he was ready for his evening feeding. Mara rose to care for him, but not before leaning down to kiss Cassian softly. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "Whatever comes, I love you too." Outside, the winter wind howled around the ranch buildings, but inside the warm house, 3 people prepared to claim their happiness in the face of whatever storms might come. The woven blanket Eleanor had made lay folded beside Thomas's cradle. Its soft wool dyed in the colors of sunset, gold and amber and deep rose, a promise that some beautiful things could grow even in the harshest seasons. Tomorrow would bring the final preparations for their wedding. The day after that would bring whatever challenge Clayton chose to mount. But tonight, surrounded by love and protected by community, Mara Ellis allowed herself to believe that some dreams really could come true, and that some forms of love, really, were strong enough to weather any storm. In the kitchen, Cookie worked late into the night on his masterpiece cake, humming softly to himself as he crafted sugar roses with the patience of a man creating something that would be remembered for generations. And in the bunkhouse, ranch hands cleaned their weapons and checked their ammunition, preparing to defend something more precious than cattle or land. They were preparing to defend the idea that love should triumph over power, that kindness should defeat cruelty, and that some families were worth any sacrifice to protect. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like a field of diamonds. Mara woke before sunrise, unable to sleep any longer, and found herself drawn to the window to watch the ranch come alive in the pre-dawn darkness. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Cassian Holt. The thought filled her with a joy so profound, it almost frightened her in its intensity. After 7 months of marriage to Clayton that had felt like a prison sentence, the idea of marrying for love seemed almost too wonderful to be real. Elena knocked softly on her door, just as the first light appeared on the horizon. "Time to begin, my dear. This is going to be a day to remember." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. The borrowed wedding dress fit perfectly after Elena's careful alterations, and the generational veil transformed Mara into a vision of bridal elegance that brought tears to several observers' eyes. In the nursery, Thomas slept peacefully in his finest baby clothes, blissfully unaware that today would make him officially a Holt. Downstairs, the ranch house had been transformed into something approaching a cathedral. Evergreen boughs and winter roses filled every available space. Candles flickered in the windows, and Cookie's magnificent 3-layer cake sat in pride of place on the dining room table, adorned with sugar roses that looked almost real. The guests began arriving by mid-morning, neighboring ranchers and their families, townspeople from Buffalo Creek who had made the difficult winter journey, and even a delegation from Cheyenne led by Judge Morrison. Dr. Richardson served as an unofficial host, greeting arrivals and making sure everyone felt welcome. It was Dr. Richardson who first noticed the unusual activity on the main road. A group of riders approached from the direction of Buffalo Creek. Too many riders, moving with military precision rather than the casual approach of wedding guests. "Cassian," he called quietly, drawing the groom aside. "We may have company coming." Cassian followed the doctor's gaze and immediately understood the situation. 20 men rode toward the ranch in formation, their leader clearly visible, even at a distance. Clayton Blackwood had come to reclaim what he considered his property, and he had brought sufficient force to ensure compliance. "Jake," Cassian called, to his foreman, who was adjusting his rarely worn formal jacket. "Signal the boys. It looks like our uninvited guests have arrived." Within moments, The ranch hands who had been celebrating just minutes before transformed into a defensive force. Weapons appeared with practiced efficiency, and strategic positions were quietly taken. The wedding guests, many of whom had faced similar threats on their own land, understood immediately what was happening and moved to protective positions without being asked. Clayton Blackwood rode at the head of his hired force with the bearing of a man absolutely certain of his authority. Even from a distance, his expensive clothes and immaculate grooming marked him as someone accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Behind him rode men whose profession was clearly violence, hard-faced individuals with the kind of weapons that spoke of serious intent. "Mrs. Blackwood," Clayton called out as his group halted just outside the ranch yard. "I've come to collect my wife and child. This charade has gone on quite long enough." Mara appeared on the porch in her wedding dress, flanked by Cassian and Elena. The sight of her obvious happiness and the loving support surrounding her seemed to enrage Clayton even further. "You look well, Mara," he said with the cold politeness that she remembered so vividly. "Marriage preparations seem to agree with you. However, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You're already married. To me." "Not for much longer," Judge Morrison announced, stepping forward with an official document in his hand. "The territorial court has granted Mrs. Ellis a divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. The marriage between Clayton Blackwood and Mara Ellis was legally dissolved as of yesterday morning." Clayton's composure cracked for the first time, his face darkening with fury. "Impossible. I received no notice of such proceedings. Notice was sent to your legal address in Buffalo Creek as required by law. Your failure to respond or appear constituted acceptance of the charges. You cannot dissolve a marriage without the husband's consent." "Under territorial law, we can and we have," Judge Morrison replied calmly. "Mrs. Ellis is a free woman, legally entitled to marry whomever she chooses." It was then that Clayton made his fatal mistake. He revealed the true scope of his interests. "This isn't just about my wife, Your Honor. This is about justice and property rights. Mr. Holt has been illegally mining silver on land that belongs to me." A silence fell over the assembled crowd as the implications of Clayton's words sank in. Cassian's face went perfectly still, the kind of dangerous calm that preceded explosive action. "What did you just say?" Cassian asked, his voice deadly quiet. Clayton, realizing he had revealed more than intended, tried to recover. "The mineral rights to this land were transferred to me as part of a business arrangement years ago. Your mining operations have been illegal from the beginning." From his jacket, Clayton produced a document with an official seal. "This deed, properly filed with the Territorial Land Office, gives me ownership of all mineral rights on this property, dating back 5 years. Jake Morrison moved closer to examine the document, his face growing darker with each line he read. "Boss, this thing claims to be signed by your brother Thomas, selling the mineral rights for $500. "Thomas never sold anything to anyone," Cassian said, his voice rising with controlled fury, "especially not to Clayton Blackwood. He never even met the man. Nevertheless, the document is legally filed and properly notarized," Clayton replied, with returning confidence, "which means every ounce of silver you've extracted from this land has been theft. The territorial courts take a very serious view of mineral theft, Mr. Holt." Dr. Richardson stepped forward, studying the document with the careful attention of a man trained to notice details. "This is interesting. The signature is quite good, almost perfect, in fact." "What do you mean, almost?" Judge Morrison asked. "I mean that whoever forged Thomas Holt's signature made one small mistake. Thomas was left-handed. I treated him for a broken wrist when he was 12, and I distinctly remember it was his left wrist that kept him from writing for weeks. This signature was made by someone right-handed." A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications became clear. Clayton had not only pursued Mara through legal manipulation, but he had also been systematically stealing Cassian's mineral wealth through fraudulent documents. Furthermore, Dr. Richardson continued, warming to his subject, I was present when Thomas Holt died 5 years ago. This document is dated 3 weeks after his death. Even if the signature were genuine, it would be legally invalid. Clayton's face had gone white with rage and calculation. The legal trap he had constructed was collapsing around him, but he still had 20 armed men at his back. Forgery is a serious charge, Dr. Richardson. I hope you're prepared to prove such accusations in court. I'm prepared to prove them right here, Judge Morrison announced. As a territorial judge, I have the authority to examine evidence and make preliminary rulings on matters of fraud and theft. What followed was a careful examination of the fraudulent deed, with multiple witnesses providing testimony about Thomas Holt's left-handedness, his date of death, and his character. Clayton's hired men grew increasingly restless as it became clear that their employer's legal position was crumbling. The document is clearly fraudulent, Judge Morrison announced after 20 minutes of examination. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to defraud the territorial government. You can't arrest me, Clayton snarled, his veneer of civilization finally slipping completely. I have 20 men here who disagree with your authority, and I have 30 men here who respect the law, Cassian replied calmly. Looking around, Clayton realized that the wedding guests weren't just celebrating neighbors. They were a coalition of ranchers and townspeople who had been waiting for exactly this moment to challenge his abuse of power. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Morrison said formally, you have a choice. You can surrender peacefully and face trial in a territorial court, or you can resist arrest and face the consequences of that decision. Clayton's eyes darted between the judge, the assembled crowd, and his own hired gunmen. For a moment it seemed he might choose violence over surrender, but even his mercenaries could count, and the odds were not in their favor. This isn't over, Clayton said finally, his voice thick with frustrated rage. I have resources you can't imagine, influence that reaches further than this backward territory. Perhaps, Judge Morrison replied, producing a set of handcuffs. But today, in this place, the law applies to everyone equally. As Clayton was placed under arrest, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. But the real celebration came when Judge Morrison turned to Cassian and Mara, who were still standing on the porch in their wedding clothes. Now then, he said with a broad smile, I believe we have a wedding to conduct, unless the bride and groom have changed their minds about the timing. Not for anything, Mara replied, her voice strong and clear. I've waited long enough to marry the man I love. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything anyone present had ever witnessed. Conducted on the ranch house porch with the arrested Clayton under guard nearby, it was simultaneously a celebration of love and a declaration of justice triumphant. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that arose could be heard for miles across the snow-covered landscape. As Cassian kissed his bride, Thomas began crying in Eleanor's arms, as if protesting being left out of such an important moment. When Cassian took his son, for Thomas was truly his son now, the baby settled immediately, looking up at his parents with the solemn attention of someone who understood that something significant had just occurred. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Morrison announced to the assembled crowd, may I present Mr. and Mrs. Cassian Holt and their son, Thomas. The legal document of land ownership that had seemed so threatening just hours before now lay in pieces, evidence of a crime that would send Clayton to prison for years. But more importantly, it had revealed the true scope of his corruption and given the territorial authorities grounds to investigate his other business dealings. As the celebration moved inside for cake and dancing, Mara found herself overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her circumstances. This morning, she had been a woman preparing to marry for love. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a witness to justice long delayed. Are you all right? Cassian asked, noting her thoughtful expression as they watched their guests celebrate. "I'm perfect," she replied, adjusting Thomas in her arms. "I was just thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we never could have imagined." "And what's the best thing you never could have imagined?" "This, all of this. A husband who loves me, a son who will grow up safe and cherished, a community that stands up for what's right." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "A family that chose each other." Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but inside the warm house, surrounded by friends and family and the promise of a future built on love rather than fear, Mr. and Mrs. Cassian Holt began their new life together, knowing that some battles were worth fighting, some love was worth any risk, and some families were strong enough to weather any storm. The celebration following Mara and Cassian's wedding lasted well into the evening, but beneath the joy lay an undercurrent of tension that everyone felt but no one wanted to voice. Clayton's arrest had been a victory, but his parting words about resources and influence beyond the territory carried the weight of truth. Men like Clayton Blackwood didn't build empires without establishing networks of power that could operate independently of their personal presence. Judge Morrison confirmed these fears during a private conversation with Cassian as the guests began departing. "I'll be taking Blackwood to Cheyenne for trial," he said, his voice low enough that only Cassian could hear. "But I want you to understand, his arrest today was just the beginning, not the end." "What do you mean?" "Clayton's business operations extend far beyond Buffalo Creek. I've been investigating his activities for months, and what we discovered today about the fraudulent mineral rights is likely just one piece of a much larger pattern of corruption." Judge Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's been systematically acquiring property and businesses through legal manipulation, forgery, and intimidation. Your ranch was just one target on a very long list." Cassian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "How many others are there?" "At least a dozen properties that we know of, probably more. Small ranches, mining claims, even some businesses in town, all acquired through questionable legal maneuvers that suddenly make sense when you consider that the documents were likely forged. And his network of supporters. That's what worries me most. Clayton didn't operate alone. He had lawyers, judges, land office officials, and business partners who were either complicit in his schemes or unknowingly facilitating them. Some of those people are going to be very motivated to prevent a full investigation." As the implications sank in, Cassian realized that today's victory might have actually increased the danger to his family. Clayton in jail was one threat neutralized, but Clayton's criminal enterprise exposed was a much larger threat awakened. "What do you recommend?" Cassian asked. "Extra security. Keep your men close and your defenses ready, and consider sending Mara and the baby somewhere safe until this is fully resolved." When Cassian shared this conversation with Mara that evening, she listened with the calm attention of a woman who had already faced worse fears and survived them. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. "We just got married, we just became a legal family, and I'm not going to be driven away by threats from Clayton's business associates. Mara, if there's a wider conspiracy, then we'll face it together. Thomas deserves to grow up on this ranch, and I deserve to build a life here with you. Running away won't solve anything. It will just delay the inevitable confrontation." Elena, who had been quietly cleaning up the remnants of the wedding celebration, paused in her work. "The girl's right. Men like Clayton have been terrorizing this territory for too long. Someone has to make a stand." Over the following days, evidence of the broader conspiracy began to emerge. Dr. Richardson brought word from Buffalo Creek that Clayton's arrest had triggered a flurry of activity among his business associates. Several men had left town suddenly, taking important documents with them. The bank that had tried to call in Cassian's loans was now claiming that the demand letters had been sent in error without authorization from the bank's board of directors. More troubling was the news that arrived through Jake Morrison's network of contacts among other ranch foremen. 3 properties that had been acquired by Clayton through questionable means were now being contested by their original owners, who were coming forward with evidence that their sales had been coerced or their documents had been forged. "It's like a dam breaking," Jake reported during one of their evening strategy sessions. "People who were too scared to speak up before are finding their courage now that Clayton's in custody, which means his associates are going to be desperate to shut down the investigation before it exposes everyone involved," Cassian replied grimly. "The first direct threat came 5 days after the wedding, delivered by a stranger who approached the ranch house just after sunset. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to conducting delicate business negotiations. "Mr. Holt," he said with formal politeness, "my name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests that have been affected by recent events in Buffalo Creek." "What kind of business interests?" Cassian asked, positioning himself between the stranger and the house where Mara was nursing Thomas. "The kind that value stability and discretion above all else. My clients are prepared to offer you a very generous settlement for any inconvenience you may have suffered due to Mr. Blackwood's unfortunate legal difficulties." "What kind of settlement?" Webb produced a leather portfolio and withdrew a document. $50,000 to be paid immediately in exchange for your agreement. To drop all claims related to the disputed mineral rights and to refrain from pursuing any further legal action against Mr. Blackwood or his business associates. The sum was staggering, more money than most ranchers saw in a lifetime. But Cassian understood immediately what was really being offered: enough money to disappear quietly, leaving Clayton's criminal network intact and unpunished. "And if I refuse?" Webb's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "My clients would be very disappointed. They've invested considerable time and resources in establishing their business relationships in this territory. They view Mr. Blackwood's legal troubles as a temporary setback, not a permanent solution. Tell your clients that justice isn't for sale, Mr. Webb. Clayton forged legal documents, stole my family's property, and abused his wife. No amount of money will make me walk away from that. I was hoping you might reconsider. 48 hours is a long time to think about such a generous offer." Webb returned the document to his portfolio. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Buffalo Creek until Wednesday. After that, my clients may be forced to explore alternative solutions." After Webb departed, Cassian called a meeting of his most trusted men. The ranch's informal leadership gathered in the main house parlor. Jake Morrison, Cookie, Elena, Dr. Richardson, and several of the senior hands who had been with the ranch the longest. "They're offering us money to disappear," Cassian explained, summarizing Webb's visit, "which tells me they're scared of what a full investigation will reveal." "How scared are they?" Jake asked. "Scared enough to offer $50,000 to make it go away. Scared enough to threaten violence if we don't take the money." Cookie, whose real name remained a mystery but whose loyalty was absolute, spoke up from the corner where he'd been sharpening his skinning knife. "I say we take their measure. Been too long since this territory had a proper reckoning with the kind of men who think money makes them above the law. It's not just about us anymore," Elena pointed out. "There are other families involved now, other people finding the courage to challenge what's been done to them. If we back down, they'll all suffer for it." Dr. Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about this since the wedding. Clayton's network extends into the territorial government itself. Judge Harrison in Buffalo Creek, the land office. Officials who validated the forged documents, possibly even some people in Cheyenne. This is bigger than one man's criminal enterprise. It's systematic corruption, which means they'll fight hard to protect it," Cassian said. "But it also means we're not alone," Mara said, entering the room with Thomas in her arms. "Every family they've cheated, every ranch they've stolen, every business they've destroyed, they're all potential allies if we can reach them." Cassian looked around the room at the faces of people who had chosen to stand with him, people who understood that some fights were about more than personal grievances. What do you all think? Do we take the money and disappear, or do we see this through? The vote was unanimous and immediate. Not one person in the room was willing to accept Clayton's blood money or abandon the fight for justice. Then we prepare for war, Jake Morrison said simply, because that's what this is going to become. The next 48 hours were spent in careful preparation. Messages were sent to neighboring ranchers, calling in favors and building alliances. Weapons were cleaned and ammunition counted. Defensive positions around the ranch buildings were reinforced. Most importantly, a detailed plan was developed to protect Mara and Thomas if violence erupted. Elena took charge of creating a safe room in the root cellar, stocked with supplies for several days and accessible through a hidden entrance in the kitchen pantry. If shooting starts, she told Mara firmly, you take that baby and you get to the cellar. Don't argue, don't try to help, just protect yourself and Thomas. I can shoot, Mara protested. Cassian's been teaching me, and I hope you never have to use that skill. But your first responsibility is to that child, and his first need is a living mother. On the evening before Webb's deadline expired, Cassian found himself alone with his family for perhaps the last peaceful moment they might have for some time. Thomas was sleeping in his cradle, making the soft sounds that had become the soundtrack of their domestic happiness. Mara sat beside the fire, mending one of Cassian's shirts with the competent movements of a woman settling into her role as a ranch wife. Do you regret it? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. Marrying into this mess? Never, she replied without hesitation. I regret that Clayton forced this confrontation, but I don't regret choosing to build a life with you. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it as a family. I love you, Mara Holt. I love you and Thomas more than my own life. I know you do, and I love you the same way, which is why I need you to promise me something, anything. Promise me that if this goes badly, if they overwhelm our defenses, you'll get yourself and Thomas to safety. Don't try to be a hero at the cost of leaving your son without a father. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, understanding what she was really asking. I promise, but only if you promise me the same thing, that you'll protect Thomas above all else, even if it means leaving me behind. I promise. Outside, the winter wind howled around the ranch buildings, but inside the warm house, a husband and wife made the kind of vows that went deeper than wedding ceremonies. Promises born from love so profound that each was willing to sacrifice themselves to ensure the other's survival. The family rifle that had belonged to Cassian's father sat cleaned and loaded on the mantelpiece, its presence both comforting and ominous. In the morning, Webb would receive Cassian's final answer to the bribe offer. And after that, there would be no more negotiations, no more legal maneuvering, no more civilized pretenses. After that, there would be only the kind of frontier justice that came when good people decided they had endured enough corruption, and when love proved stronger than fear, and when a man with everything to lose chose to fight rather than surrender the future he had built with his own hands and heart. Thomas stirred in his cradle, opening his dark blue eyes to look at his parents, with the trusting gaze of someone who knew he was safe and loved. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges Webb's clients chose to send, but tonight, surrounded by the warmth of family and the strength of community, the Holt family prepared to defend something more precious than silver or land. They prepared to defend the right to choose love over power, justice over convenience, and courage over compromise. Wednesday morning arrived with an eerie stillness that seemed to muffle even the usual sounds of ranch life. The cattle stood quietly in their pens, the horses moved restlessly in the corrals, and even the chickens seemed subdued, as if all the animals sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Cassian stood on the front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, holding his father's rifle and watching the main road. Beside him, Jake Morrison checked his sidearm for the third time, his movements automatic and precise. "Fog's rolling in," Jake observed, nodding toward the low-lying mist that was beginning to obscure the distant hills. Could work for us or against us, depending on how they approach. Either way, we'll be ready." Cassian's voice was calm, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't just another confrontation with cattle thieves or claimed jumpers. This was a battle for everything they had built, everything they loved. Inside the house, Elena moved efficiently through her morning routines, but her attention remained focused on Mara and Thomas. The baby was unusually fussy, as if picking up on the stress that permeated the household, and Mara paced the parlor trying to soothe him. "He knows something's wrong," Mara said, adjusting Thomas in her arms. "Babies sense these things." "Smart boy, like his parents," Elena replied, checking the supplies she had prepared for the safe room one final time. "When this starts, you remember what we discussed. No hesitation." At 8 o'clock, a lone rider appeared on the road, not Webb returning for an answer, but a young man Cassian recognized as Tommy Fletcher, who worked at the hotel in Buffalo Creek. He rode hard, his horse, lathered with sweat despite the cold morning air. "Mr. Holt," he called out as he reached the ranch yard, "Mr. Webb sent me with a message. He said to tell you that his patience has run out and that his employers are taking immediate action to resolve their business concerns." "What kind of immediate action?" Cassian asked, though he suspected he already knew. 25 men, sir, maybe more. They rode out of town an hour ago, well armed and looking like they meant business. Mr. Webb said to tell you that this was your last chance." To reconsider his generous offer, Cassian handed the boy a silver dollar. "Tell Mr. Webb that the Holt family doesn't negotiate with criminals or accept bribes from thieves. If his employers want a fight, they'll get one." After Tommy Fletcher rode away, carrying Cassian's defiant message back to town, the ranch transformed into a fortress. The defensive positions that had been planned were quickly occupied. Ranch hands took cover behind water troughs, hay bales, and the thick walls of the barn. The house itself became the central stronghold, with clear fields of fire in all directions. Cookie positioned himself in the kitchen with a shotgun and a grim smile. "Been too long since I had a proper fight," he announced to no one in particular. "These town boys are about to learn what ranch fighting looks like." Dr. Richardson, who had insisted on staying despite the danger, established a medical station in the dining room. "I've seen too much of Clayton's handiwork over the years," he explained when Cassian tried to convince him to leave. "It's time someone made him and his associates pay for what they've done." The attack came just after 9 o'clock, announced by the thunder of hoofbeats and the harsh shouts of men who believed that superior numbers guaranteed victory. Through the morning fog, Cassian could see them approaching in a rough line, hard-faced mercenaries armed with rifles and revolvers, led by a man whose military bearing suggested professional experience with violence. "Remember," Cassian called out to his defenders, "these aren't lawmen. They're hired guns working for criminals. You're defending your homes and families." The first shots rang out when the attackers reached the outer fence line. Cassian's men had the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain, but the attackers had superior numbers and professional discipline. What followed was a fierce exchange of gunfire that shattered the morning stillness and sent smoke drifting across the ranch yard. From her position in the main house, Mara could hear the battle raging outside, the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns, and the occasional cry of a man who had been hit. Thomas wailed in her arms, frightened by the noise, and she found herself singing softly to him, the same lullaby Elena had taught her weeks earlier. "It's all right, my darling," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring Thomas or herself. "Papa's protecting us. Papa and all the good people who believe in what's right." Elena appeared at her side, carrying a rifle of her own. "Time to move to the cellar, child. The shooting's getting closer." But as they prepared to retreat to the safe room, a new sound reached them, the splintering of wood as the front door burst open. 3 men rushed into the parlor, their faces flushed with the excitement of battle and their weapons ready for violence. "Well, well," said the leader, a scarred man with dead eyes who seemed to enjoy the fear he inspired. "Look what we found. The lady of the house and her bastard child." Mara backed toward the fireplace, clutching Thomas protectively. Elena stepped between them and the intruders, her rifle raised and her face set in lines of fierce determination. "You'll not touch them," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Not while I'm breathing." The scarred man laughed. "Old woman, you're outnumbered 3-1. Put down that rifle and maybe we'll make this quick." "Maybe you should count again," Elena replied. The sound of a shotgun being cocked behind the intruders made them whirl. Around, Cookie stood in the doorway to the kitchen, his weapon trained on the group with rock-steady hands. "Gentlemen," Cookie said pleasantly, "I believe you've made a navigation error. This is a private home, and you weren't invited." What followed happened with the lightning speed of frontier violence. The scarred man swung his pistol toward Cookie. Eleanor's rifle spoke with deadly authority, and the shotgun's roar filled the room with thunder and smoke. When the silence returned, 2 of the intruders lay still on the parlor floor, and the third was clutching a wounded arm while staring at Eleanor with newfound respect. "Now then," Eleanor said, reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency, "I believe you gentlemen were just leaving." Outside, the battle continued to rage with desperate intensity. Cassian moved between defensive positions, encouraging his men and directing their fire with the tactical knowledge he had learned during his brief service in the territorial militia. Jake Morrison had positioned himself in the barn loft, where his rifle commanded the approaches to the main house. The attackers were discovering that ranch hands, who spent their days dealing with dangerous animals and harsh weather, were not easily intimidated. Billy Santos, barely 19 years old, had already accounted for 2 of the mercenaries with his Winchester. Old Pete Garrison, despite being past 60, moved with the agility of a man half his age as he kept the water supply secure. But the professional nature of the attack was beginning to tell. The mercenaries had spread out to attack from multiple directions, and their superior firepower was slowly forcing the defenders back toward the central buildings. A burning brand thrown onto the barn roof began to smolder, threatening to spread to the main structure. "Boss!" Jake Morrison called from his position. "They're trying to burn us out." Cassian looked toward the house where his wife and son were, sheltering then at the spreading fire that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The moment of decision had arrived: continue the defensive battle and risk losing everything to fire, or take the offensive and drive the attackers back. The choice was made for him when he saw smoke beginning to rise from the main house. One of the attackers had managed to reach the building and was attempting to set it ablaze from the backside, where the defenders couldn't see him. "Jake!" Cassian shouted. "Take 5 men and circle around the house. Stop that fire before it spreads." "What about you? I'm going to end this." Cassian gripped his father's rifle tighter, thinking of his brother Thomas, of his parents, of all the generations of Holts who had built this ranch with their own hands and hearts. "No one burns my family's home." With a war cry that would have made his ancestors proud, Cassian Holt charged toward the enemy positions, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as he advanced. Behind him, his men followed with the desperate courage of people fighting for everything they loved. The battle was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn, and in the house that Thomas Holt had built and that Cassian Holt was determined to defend, a mother held her child close and whispered prayers for the man who had chosen to love them both. Knowing that some forms of love were indeed strong enough to overcome any force arrayed against them, Cassian's charge across the ranch yard became the turning point of the battle. His father's rifle, which had defended this land for 2 generations, found its targets with deadly precision as he advanced toward the mercenaries' position. Behind him, Jake Morrison and the ranch hands followed with the kind of desperate courage that comes from fighting for home and family. The mercenaries, accustomed to intimidating settlers and overwhelming smaller forces, found themselves facing something they hadn't expected, men who knew every inch of the ground they fought on and who had everything to lose. Billy Santos flanked their position from the creek bed, his Winchester speaking with rapid authority. Old Pete Garrison emerged from behind the water trough like an avenging spirit, his ancient Colt Navy revolver proving that some weapons never lost their effectiveness in skilled hands. Inside the house, Mara extinguished the fire that had been started on the back wall, while Eleanor maintained watch over their wounded prisoner. The man sat on the floor, clutching his arm and staring at the two women with newfound respect for what he had mistaken as easy targets. "You shot my arm off, you crazy old woman," he muttered, though his tone held more admiration than anger. "I shot your arm precisely where I intended to shoot it," Elena replied calmly. "If I had wanted to kill you, you'd be decorating my parlor floor like your friends." Thomas had finally stopped crying, settling into sleep with the peculiar ability of babies to find peace even in chaos. Mara held him close, listening to the gunfire outside and praying that Cassian would survive the battle he was fighting for their future. The tide of combat shifted again when unexpected reinforcements arrived. Dr. Richardson, from his position in the dining room, was the first to spot the dust cloud approaching from the direction of Buffalo Creek. "Riders coming!" he called out. "Looks like 20 or more!" For a moment, Cassian's heart sank as he thought Webb had sent additional mercenaries. But as the riders came closer, he recognized the lead horseman, Sheriff Bradley, riding hard with a posse of townspeople and neighboring ranchers behind him. "This is the law!" Sheriff Bradley shouted as his men dismounted and took positions. "Throw down your weapons and surrender!" The mercenaries found themselves caught in a crossfire between Cassian's defenders and the sheriff's posse. Their professional discipline began to crumble as it became clear that their mission had become a disaster. Some threw down their weapons immediately, while others tried to fight their way out of the trap. Their leader, the military-bearing man who had led the assault, proved to have more honor than his employers. Seeing that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties, he raised his hands and called for his men to surrender. "Cease fire!" he commanded. "We're done here." The sudden silence that followed the end of gunfire was almost as startling as the battle itself had been. Smoke drifted across the ranch yard, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. But the immediate danger had passed. Sheriff Bradley approached Cassian with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Mr. Holt, I owe you an apology. It took us too long to piece together what was really happening here." "What changed your mind?" Cassian asked, lowering his father's rifle but keeping it ready. "Judge Morrison's investigation in Cheyenne uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that reaches much deeper than we thought. Clayton wasn't just forging individual documents. He was part of a network that's been systematically stealing property throughout the territory." Jake Morrison emerged from the barn, his rifle still smoking and his face grim with satisfaction. "How many of our boys were hit?" "3 wounded, none serious," Dr. Richardson reported, already moving to treat the injured. "We were fortunate. And them," Cassian nodded toward the surrendering mercenaries. 4 dead, 6 wounded, the rest surrendering," Sheriff Bradley replied. "Their leader is being very cooperative now that he realizes who his employers really were." As the immediate aftermath of the battle was sorted out, Mara emerged from the house with Thomas in her arms. The sight of her husband alive and unharmed brought tears of relief to her eyes, and when Cassian wrapped his arms around both of them, she felt the profound gratitude of someone who had nearly lost everything that mattered. "It's over," Cassian said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over. Is it really?" Mara asked, looking around at the damage to their home and property. Sheriff Bradley overheard her question and approached with a document in his hand. "Mrs. Holt, I think this will answer your concerns. It's a warrant for the arrest of Marcus Webb and his associates, issued by the Territorial Court in Cheyenne. The investigation has uncovered enough evidence to shut down their entire operation." Elena appeared in the doorway, surveying the scene with the practical eye of someone already planning the cleanup and repairs. "Well?" she announced. "I suppose. We'll need to redecorate the parlor. Bloodstains are so difficult to explain to visitors." Cookie emerged from the kitchen, his shotgun broken open and a satisfied expression on his weathered face. "Anyone else hungry? Because I've got a venison stew that's been simmering all morning, and shooting up the place always gives me an appetite." The normalcy of Elena's concern about decorating and Cookie's invitation to lunch brought laughter from the assembled crowd, the kind of laughter that comes after great tension has been released and danger has passed. As the sheriff's posse helped secure the prisoners and tend to the wounded, Thomas Whitman from the Buffalo Creek Gazette arrived with his camera and notepad. "Mr. Holt, I wonder if I might interview you about today's events. The people of this territory deserve to know how corruption was defeated and justice was served." Later that afternoon, as the last of the official business was completed and the ranch began to return to normal, Cassian found himself standing in the nursery where Thomas slept peacefully in his cradle. The baby's first tooth had appeared during the chaos of the morning, a small white pearl that seemed to symbolize new life persisting and growing despite the violence that had surrounded them. Mara joined him at the cradle, slipping her arm around his waist and leaning against his solid strength. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how this little boy will grow up in a world where the law means something, where corruption doesn't go unpunished, where good people can build something lasting without having it stolen by men who think might makes right, and what else?" Cassian turned to face his wife, seeing in her eyes the same profound gratitude and love that filled his own heart. "I'm thinking about how the three of us are going to spend the rest of our lives proving that love really is stronger than fear, that families built on choice are stronger than those built on obligation, and that some things are worth any fight." Outside their window, the ranch was already being restored to order. The burned sections of barn roof were being repaired, the bullet holes in the walls were being patched, and life was returning to the peaceful rhythm that had been so violently interrupted. But more importantly, the broader community was healing as well. Word had already spread that Clayton's criminal network had been destroyed, that the forged documents would be invalidated, and that the stolen properties would be returned to their rightful owners. Justice, long delayed, was finally being served. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, now cleaned of all evidence of the morning's violence, Mara nursed Thomas while Cassian read aloud from Hamlet. The domestic peace felt precious after the day's chaos, a reminder of what they had fought to protect and what they would continue to defend. "Do you think Thomas will remember any of this?" Mara asked softly. "I hope not. I hope he'll grow up thinking that love and safety are normal, that parents protect their children, that home is a place where you're always welcome." Cassian closed the book and moved to sit beside his wife and son. "But if he does remember, I hope he'll understand that some things are worth fighting for." Thomas opened his dark blue eyes and looked up at his parents with the solemn attention of someone who seemed to understand that something important had been accomplished. His tiny fist wrapped around Cassian's finger with surprising strength, holding on as if he knew that this man was his anchor in the world, his protector, his father, in every way that mattered. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but it no longer carried threats of violence or promises of retribution. It was simply wind, part of the natural world that surrounded their ranch, their home, their sanctuary. And inside the warm house, a family that had been forged in adversity settled into the profound peace that comes when love triumphs over hate, when justice defeats corruption, and when courage proves stronger than any force arrayed against it. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning in May, Mara stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching Thomas take his first tentative steps across the newly refinished parlor floor. At 10 months old, he was walking earlier than most children, driven by a determination that reminded everyone of both his parents. "Come to Mama," Mara called, kneeling with her arms outstretched as Thomas wobbled toward her with the serious concentration of someone accomplishing something monumentous. When he reached her, collapsing into her arms with a triumphant giggle. The small victory felt as significant as any of the larger battles they had won. The ranch had not only recovered from the damage inflicted during the battle, but had thrived. In the months since Clayton's criminal network was dismantled, the silver mines were producing at record levels, the cattle herd had grown substantially, and Cassian had been approached by 3 neighboring ranchers about forming a cooperative to improve their collective bargaining power with buyers in Denver. More importantly, the Holt Ranch had become something of a symbol throughout the territory. Proof that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win, that love and courage could triumph over money and influence. The story of their struggle had been published in newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco, inspiring other communities to challenge similar forms of organized criminality. Elena appeared in the doorway, carrying the morning mail and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose predictions had been thoroughly vindicated. "Letter from Judge Morrison," she announced, settling into her favorite rocking chair. "And one from that newspaper reporter in Denver who's been following the corruption trials." The trials had been the sensation of the territory throughout the winter and spring. Clayton himself had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his health broken by months of confinement and the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. Marcus Webb and his associates had received similar sentences, and the network of corrupt officials who had facilitated their schemes had been systematically removed from office. "What does the judge say?" Cassian asked, looking up from the account. Books he had been reviewing. The ranch's financial position was stronger than it had ever been, but he maintained the careful attention to detail that had helped him build his prosperity. Mara opened the letter and scanned its contents, her expression growing brighter with each paragraph. "Clayton's appeal has been denied by the Territorial Supreme Court. His conviction is final." She continued reading, then looked up with wonder in her eyes. "And there's more. The court has ordered full restitution to all the families whose property was stolen through forged documents. We're not the only ones getting justice." The second letter contained equally good news. The Denver Reporter had been commissioned to write a book about the corruption scandal and its resolution, with particular focus on the role of the Holt family in exposing and defeating the criminal network. The publisher was offering a substantial advance for the rights to their story. "I don't know about having our lives turned into a book," Cassian said thoughtfully. "Some things feel too personal to share with strangers. But think about the good it could do," Mara replied. "If our story helps other families find the courage to stand up to similar abuse, isn't that worth some loss of privacy?" It was a conversation they would have many times in the coming weeks, but the decision was ultimately made for them when they received a visit from Sarah Patterson, whose neighboring ranch had been restored to her family after Clayton's forgeries were exposed. "Mrs. Holt," Sarah said during afternoon tea in the newly redecorated parlor, "I want you to know that your courage saved my family's legacy. When I saw you refuse to be intimidated, it gave me the strength to come forward with my own evidence. There are dozens of families like mine throughout the territory who owe their future to your example." That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Mara and Cassian finally agreed to cooperate with the book project. Some stories, they realized, belonged not just to the people who lived them, but to the community that could be inspired by them. Thomas, now steady enough on his feet to explore the porch safely, played with the wooden rocking horse that Cassian had carved during those anxious weeks before his birth. The toy horse showed signs of loving use, smooth spots where small hands had gripped it, gentle wear marks that spoke of countless hours of play. "He's going to need a real horse soon," Cassian observed, watching his son's fascination with anything that moved on 4 legs. "A gentle one," Mara said with the protective instincts of a mother. "Something patient and kind. Like his parents," Elena added from her position in the doorway, where she had been observing the peaceful domestic scene. With deep satisfaction, This child is going to grow up knowing exactly what love looks like. As summer approached, the ranch buzzed with new activity. Word had spread throughout the territory that the Holt Ranch was a place where people in trouble could find help and sanctuary. 3 young women had already stayed in the guest quarters while escaping various forms of family violence or economic desperation. Each had moved on to independent lives, but not before learning that there were places in the world where kindness was more powerful than cruelty. The guest quarters had been expanded and formalized into what Eleanor proudly called the refuge, a set of rooms specifically maintained for travelers in need. It was supported by donations from throughout the territory, contributed by people who understood that some investments yielded returns measured in human dignity rather than financial profit. Dr. Richardson had become a regular visitor, not just for medical emergencies, but as a friend and advisor whose wisdom was valued by the entire community. On this particular evening, he brought news that brought the story full circle. "I thought you should know," he said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into the chair that had become permanently designated as his. "Dr. Cruz lost his medical license last week. The Territorial Medical Board found that his examination of Mrs. Ellis constituted professional misconduct of the highest order. I almost feel sorry for him," Mara said, though her tone suggested her sympathy was limited. He probably never expected his willingness to bend ethics for Clayton would cost him his career. "Some lessons come late, but stick permanently," Dr. Richardson replied philosophically. "The important thing is that other physicians now understand the consequences of allowing their professional judgment to be corrupted by political or financial pressure." As the evening wore on, and Thomas was settled into his crib for the night, Mara and Cassian found themselves alone on the porch for one of their increasingly rare moments of uninterrupted conversation. The ranch had become busier as its reputation for hospitality grew, and parenthood had added layers of responsibility that left little time for extended private discussions. "Do you ever miss the quiet life?" Mara asked, leaning against Cassian's shoulder as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "I spent too many years living quietly, going through the motions without really engaging with life. Now we're building something that matters, creating something that will outlast us, and Thomas will grow up understanding that some things are worth fighting for. More importantly, he'll grow up understanding that love means choosing to protect rather than control, that strength means lifting others up rather than pushing them down, that real power comes from serving something larger than yourself." Above them, the same stars that had witnessed Mara's desperate flight from Clayton's house now looked down on a scene of profound peace and contentment. The silver locket that held her childhood photograph, and which she had nearly lost during those dark months of abuse, now rested safely in Thomas's nursery, waiting for the day when she would tell him about his grandmother and the dreams that had sustained multiple generations. On the mantelpiece in the parlor, a new family portrait painted by a traveling artist showed the 3 of them in formal pose, Cassian standing protectively behind his wife and son, his hand resting on Mara's shoulder while she held Thomas on her lap. But it was the informal touches that made the portrait special. The slight smile playing at the corners of Cassian's mouth, the contentment evident in Mara's relaxed posture, and Thomas's bright, curious eyes looking directly at the viewer with the confidence of a child who knew he was deeply loved. The portrait represented more than artistic documentation of their family. It symbolized their triumph over adversity, their transformation from survivors into thrivers, their evolution from a collection of wounded individuals into a unit stronger than the sum of its parts. As they prepared for bed that night, walking through the house that had been transformed from a lonely man's residence into a true family home, Mara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The woman who had fled through the Wyoming darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back had become someone she barely recognized, confident, purposeful, surrounded by love and respect. "What are you thinking about?" Cassian asked, noting her thoughtful expression as she checked on Thomas one final time. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads directly to the best thing you never could have imagined," she replied, adjusting their son's blanket, with the automatic care of practiced motherhood. "And what's the best thing you never could have imagined?" "This, all of this, a husband who sees strength in my independence rather than threat, a son who will grow up knowing what healthy love looks like, a community that values courage over conformity." She moved into Cassian's arms, feeling the solid warmth that had become her anchor in the world. A life built on choice rather than obligation. Outside their bedroom window, the ranch settled into the peaceful rhythm of night. In the bunkhouse, ranch hands shared stories and planned the next day's work. In the kitchen, Cookie cleaned up from the evening meal and prepared dough for tomorrow's bread. In the guest quarters, a young woman who had arrived that afternoon slept safely for the first time in months, protected by people who understood that some sanctuaries were sacred. And in the master bedroom of the ranch house, Mr. and Mrs. Cassian Holt fell asleep in each other's arms, surrounded by the profound peace that comes when love triumphs over fear, when justice defeats corruption, and when ordinary people discover that they are capable of extraordinary courage. When something precious needs protecting, the woven blanket that Elena had made from the ranch's own wool lay folded at the foot of their bed, its sunset colors a daily reminder that some beautiful things could grow even in the harshest seasons, and that some forms of love were indeed strong enough to weather any storm that life might bring.